and welcome to the podcast where three friends discuss environmental policies from around the planet.
Hey pals! We are back with our second full episode and our second environmental organization. I am Abha and I'm joined by my lovely friends Ala and Ajwa. We have survived the first episode and we have real followers, y'all.
Yay! We're famous!
Okay.
Okay, so before we start this episode, do you have any news to share? How have you been? How has the world been since the last episode?
Girl, it's burning, as always. We know what's happening in Texas, so...
Ajwa with the positive vibes.
Super positive vibes, Ajwa, always.
I guess since Ajwa brought up Texas, I just want to join millions of people in debunking Greg, the Abomination Abbott, the governor of this state, because he blamed AOC and the Green New Deal, and then he blamed wind and solar for the power outages, which was ridiculous. It failed because 10 years ago, when the state had the chance to weatherize, they didn't. And if you don't know what weatherization is, simply put, you just prepare the plant for extreme weather conditions. Even then, most of Texas's energy still comes from natural gas plants and coal plants. So I don't know why he had to bring that up and look stupid. And colder places like Minnesota have tons of wind turbines and they're not freezing over because they take care of them. You could literally just spray them and then it's taken care of. And yes, that has its own issues. But for him to blame that, I think was really lazy. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Oh, thank you for finally talking against Texas.
Oh my God, Ajwa.
What? I thought you were now Confederate County.
Dang!
Wow. You know what? No words. Please continue.
Now, if you've listened to our first episode, you know that in this series, we're talking about regulatory agencies around the world. We have already talked about UNEP. Do send us your questions about that still if you have any. And in this episode, we are talking about the IUCN. The IUCN is an important organization with roots in policy and conservation around the world. It stands for International Union for Conservation of Nature, and it does just that. However, it is a little bit different from UNEP, which we talked in the last episode, and other organizations, because it is made up of a membership union, which includes both government and civil society organizations, as well as an extensive panel of experts which all have inputs on what they do. The main things the IUCN does are research and outreach in terms of data gathering, analysis, research projects in the field, advocacy, and education. And they do this actively in more than 160 countries.
Wow.
While the UNEP was more important on the national and the government level, the IUCN is more important when it comes to providing the research backbone that is required for taking action towards conservation.
So would you say it's more community-based then?
Yes, a little bit more community-based, but even more so, instead of taking front and center on policy, they take more front and center on the research bit that then informs policy decisions.
Okay.
So they have been defined as the go-to authority when it comes to examining the status of the natural world, which is a really big title to have.
Big flex.
Mm-hmm. So they also have something which is a little bit different from the UNEP. They have one specific well-developed vision and a specific mission statement for the whole union. The vision they have is a just world that values and conserves nature. And the mission they have is influence, encourage, and assist societies to conserve the integrity and diversity of nature and ensure that any use of natural resources is equitable and ecologically sustainable. I would love your inputs on this.
So that's a tall order, I would say, right? Seems like they're trying to cover a lot.
I think that's a common theme that we found with most of these organizations. But like Abha said, it's like aiming for 10 miles to even go that 1 mile. But unlike the Green New Deal, they can actually afford to do this, right?
Shade, but actually, yeah, quite true.
Well, I'm really partial to this organization because the Iucn Red List is by far my most used citation. has been for years. I've been citing since my undergrad, and honestly, even I'm not familiar with how it works on the inside. So we did the research for you, and in this episode, I'll quickly talk about how and why the UN became what it is, and then hand it over to Ajwa, who will help us develop those ideas and hash out what they actually do and how they do it. And then Ala can tell us why it is important to conservation and policy.
I could try.
So on the background a little bit. Like I said, IUCN has a long history, but that's not just sort of the history of the organization. It's got a large history in my life as well. Because the first time I ever used it was in 8th grade when I was trying to impress my biology teacher.
What?
Yeah, so we had like a science fair competition thing, and biodiversity was the theme for it. And I really, really liked her. So I went and I like started researching how do I find out which like organisms in this area are endemic / endangered, which of them are like rare, etc., etc. And then I used that to do my project. It was a little bit crazy.
Girl, I don't know if I'm more impressed by your vigor to know more about science or your simping ways.
That is so, oh my God. Like, I thought I was the worst teacher's pet when I was younger, but no, you've topped it with this story.
But honestly, I have cited it ever since then. I've probably looked at the Red List every year since then. I'm sure you guys have too.
Every year since you've been impressing your 8th grade teacher? I don't think so.
Little bit of a background info. IUCN was established in 1948, so it's older than UNEP by over 20 years. It came into existence in France in a little town called Fontainebleau, and if I've butchered that word, my French people, pardon.
It's not your fault. French words are hard.
Okay, so when it was first formed, just like UNEP, changing names seems to be an important sort of connecting thread between these organizations. When it was formed, it was called the International Union for the Protection of Nature. Then it became the World Conservation Union. And then finally, it became the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, which is the IUCN. However, they still don't use this full name. Now they just call it the Union for Conservation of Nature and just drop the natural resources part.
Yeah, what is with them? Like, they have like 500 names. Like, pick a name, bro.
Exactly, it's not that hard. Anyway, it was formed as a base to bring together different countries in the world to promote nature conservation and the ecologically sustainable use of natural resources. So what does this mean? Nature conservation, which we have talked about since episode 1, is basically any effort that is taken to protect species from going extinct and to maintain and restore their wildlife habitats, along with enhancing ecosystem services and protecting biological diversity. For anyone that might not know, an ecosystem service is basically the products that we receive, like food, water, weather protection, animal products from particular ecosystems. So basically, you can say that the IUCN was formed to protect the living environment and to use the products we get from it sustainably. And before we move on, after the last episode, I think both Ala and Ajwa got a question about biodiversity. So I'm just going to quickly define this for you guys because it's a term that we will be using pretty frequently. In the simplest of terms, it is the variety of life that can be found on Earth, plants, animals, fungi, microorganisms, etc., along with the communities that they form and the habitats in which they live. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Back to the IUCN. So while the IUCN was born in France, the organization headquarters have since moved to Switzerland. In the first decade that they were in effect, they focused on studying the effects of human impact on nature, which, in 1948 was pretty revolutionary if you think about it, because that's only 3 years after World War II ended.
And I think that was that was also when, industrialization was already booming, but it was growing at a rapid speed around
Exactly. And after the war, to shift from looking at how the world is impacting the people to looking at how the people are now impacting the world is a big change.
Yeah, that's actually a beautiful way to put it.
During this first decade, they not only identified harmful pesticides and fertilizers and then flagged them, but they also introduced environmental impact assessments, which all fields of science and research, along with industry, now have to use mandatorily. Like you guys probably have heard it in chemical engineering as well.
Yes. They would not let us do anything without these things.
Of course.
Exactly, which is really cool that happened before 1960.
That's so crazy. You literally can't do anything as any kind of engineer that makes stuff. I'm not talking about software engineers. I'm talking about people that like make things.
Yeah, like actual engineers, right, Ala?
That's who I'm talking about. Yeah, I didn't want to say it, but yeah, you can't make anything without doing an environmental impact assessment.
Which is really cool that, IUCN has been responsible for that. And then in 1964, ta-da, the Iucn Red List was created. This then shifted the IUCN's focus towards a species and habitat conservation focus. And this has now made the Red List the world's most comprehensive data source on the global extinction risk of species. But this is not all that the IUCN does. The IUCN has also been integral in the creation of several international conventions. And in 1980, they actually partnered with UNEP and WWF to create the World Conservation Strategy, which has shaped the idea of sustainable development and global conservation agenda since then. In 1990s, this strategy was renamed, as they rename everything.
As their only agenda is, let's rename stuff.
To Caring for the Earth strategy. And this, interestingly, was instrumental in the creation of the Rio Conventions.
Oh, I did not know that.
So these three have been working together for a while. And now we can pass it on to Ajwa to explain the development and how this organization actually works.
Okay, yeah. So honestly, I had to really look it up. Like you said, you've used it so many times and you still didn't know how it works. It was not as straightforward, but the way that they do it is that they set up these programs which go every 4 years, that they have this conservation Congress, the World Conservation Congress. And how this program works is that it is set up by the member organizations during that Congress. And it is, the last one, I'm going to be talking about the 2017 to 2021 because I feel like that would be the most relevant one. And it was developed as a result of a 9-month consultation process across all the IUCN members and commissions. And they basically had 3 priority areas that they were going to focus on. So they had the valuing and conserving nature, which was their work on biodiversity conservation. And it was highlighting both tangible and intangible values of nature. Then they had promoting and supporting effective and equitable governance of natural resources, which was, again, people-nature relations, their rights and responsibilities, and the political economy of nature. And then they had deploying nature-based solutions to societal changes, which again, IUCN's work on nature's contribution to tackling problems. And so it is in line with the United Nations Sustainable Goals, particularly with respect to climate change, food security, and social and economic development. The way that these programs work is that they provide the framework for planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the conservation work that has been undertaken by the commissions and the secretariat, and they work with all the IUCN members as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the secretariat works with the 6 different IUCN commissions, as Abha introduced us to, with more than 16,000 members who provide all this critical knowledge and they impart their wisdom so that the program can be implemented in a very effective manner. They also developed this one program charter back in May 2011, and they had 1,300 state government and NGO members of the IUCN contribute, where there is alignment with the IUCN program, and it relies on impact indicators for biodiversity. They were supposed to meet in the 2020, but thanks to COVID, that did not happen.
It has been rescheduled for September of this year, so September 2021, and it's going to be in Marseille, which, from what I've been reading, is supposed to be focusing on climate diplomacy and action towards conservation. If you're curious, climate diplomacy, Ajwa and I were just talking about this before, The simplest way to explain it is that it's what connects the national interest and policy decision making towards conservation and climate change to effect real change locally and globally in that direction. Basically, policies that people have a say in.
Yeah.
So the way that the IUCN basically operates, they have commissions. There are 6 of these commissions that basically tie into their 15 themes that I'll talk about in a bit. The 6 commissions, well, one of them is Commission on Education and Communication, also known as the CEC, which basically works by driving through leading communication, learning, and knowledge. And a lot of their education this knowledge is based on the environment. And like, for example, they actually held Snow Leopard Day in China last year, and it just like it showed the progress that they made in protecting the high mountain species, like the snow leopard, to the government, NGO, and grassroots corporations. So just kind of showed how their whole system is working. And it actually is really working really well. Then they have a commission on ecosystem management, which promotes ecosystem-based approaches for the management of landscapes and seascapes. So obviously, because these are 2 very different territories, so in order to bring them together, I think the most popular one with them is the Red List, which we will talk about in detail in this episode. And then the agro management and nature-based solutions. Again, we will also talk about nature-based solutions. And agro management, like we just mentioned, we are obsessed with it, so we'll keep bringing it up. And then they have this Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy, which is, again, to reiterate, to bring people and nature together, which is harmonizing nature conservation and just social, cultural, environmental, and economic justice concerns of the human societies, and connecting these two to come up with real solutions, because as we have seen time. Then they have the World Commission on Environmental Law, which is the laws that they kind of come up with these commissions and all these members and all these conventions and programs and these processes that they've researched on, they've constantly debated on, and they kind of like set the legal foundations of conservation and nature and sustainable development. And the last one they have is the World Commission on Protected Areas. So all this knowledge that they've come up with from their research, from policy, and they kind of just like guide people, as these organizations usually do, just guidance of how to actually protect these areas. So they really do help in kind of setting a baseline for the entire world to really follow. How do they govern? So they have a Congress, then they have this Iucn Council, and then they have an Iucn Secretariat. And they say that their strength and mandate comes from all this diverse and powerful membership, which actually is very true, because it is more than 1,400 member organizations. And if you really have that vast of a membership program, obviously you're going to get the vision and oversight from all of them, and the union actually can do its work. So the Congress meets, like we talked about earlier. It convenes every 4 years, where the IUCN members, they set the global conservation agenda by voting on recommendations and guides the Secretariat work by passing resolutions and the IUCN program. So they're just coming up with a basic directive and a basic framework. Then the Iucn Council, it is basically the governing body of IUCN to make sure that the organization is running smoothly, because again, we need governance for anything to really run. I know these people are like, no, let us all go crazy, anarchy, please, let us run our own government. No, you cannot, okay? You're not qualified, shut up, take a seat. But so they have these members and these commission chairs and representatives from these different member organizations. So to really make everyone feel included, and honestly, it really helps the work of the union as well, because as they've found time and again, diversity really helps any organization. And then they have the secretariat that works with all these member organizations and these commissions to move whatever vision and the mission that they have into action. So this is basically around 900 staff members, and they have projects, like Abha said, in over 160 countries.
Damn, are these people hiring, bro?
Man, no, honestly, look it up, because if they are, you would want to work here. It seems like a really fun organization, I'm not even gonna lie.
It does. It seems like a super cool place to work.
Yeah. And then for the accountability and reporting, because obviously this is an organization that works on donations and just money given in by other people. So they obviously have to provide their transparency and their accountability. So that's why, like I talked about, the secretariat, this council makes sure that it's good governance. And to report, to tell people what they're doing, they have these annual reports that summarize the IUCN activities over the years. So if you guys want to look it up, everything is on their website, and literally you can, it is a very, very, very detailed website, and we have it on our show notes. We'll have it up on our social media as well. But this is actually a really fun website. You can just go on and kind of explore.
I must warn you though, it's a trap, because once you're on their website, there's so much to see.
But don't worry, because on our show notes, for each section, we put links. So you can just look at the link and it'll explain exactly what it is, so you're not lost in this giant sauce.
And honestly, guys, let's be real. You all are nerds, so you probably did get lost. Other people just be like, oh, okay, well, this is cool. Okay.
We are nerds. Ajwa, you think you're cool, but you're a nerd too. Just accept it.
Okay, sure. Fine. I'm the cool one though. And okay, so as I talked about their themes, they actually have 15 major themes. To name just a few, they have business and biodiversity, they have environmental law, forests, global policy, governance and rights, marine and polar, nature-based solutions. We will talk about this one in detail. Protected areas, ecosystem management, science and economics, water, species, world heritage. So they really do cover a lot of themes that they have in there. But we're not going to talk about all of them because there are a lot. And they essentially do have, if you really they essentially do have the same bottom line, as Abha said earlier, with their mission and their vision. As broad as it does seem, I think it really does drive the basic framework for all their future projects.
Right, that's really cool.
So one of them is environmental law. And the way that they want to advance environmental law is by developing the legal concepts and instruments. And so they really help societies apply the law that they've come up with in their areas so that they can conserve nature and ensure that any natural resources that they're using are equitable and ecologically sustainable. So they have 3 basic directives for this, that they make sure that they strengthen global and transboundary governance framework. Using transboundary resources is a real struggle. I'm sure you guys know, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so to make sure, I come from a country like Pakistan and India, Abha, we are constantly fighting over these water resources.
Oh, yeah.
And at this point, I just think India and Pakistan need a reason to fight. But I'm serious. It's one thing or another. Yesterday I was hearing, now we are at cybercrime. Great. Okay. But so when you are obviously using resources across boundaries, across borders, you definitely have to have a non-biased or an impartial organization kind of overlooking these things. Mm-hmm. And I think IUCN does a good job with that. Then they have one of the other ones that I found interesting was the global policy. Now, these are the policies that they come up with in different conventions and processes, such as the Rio Convention and CITES. We love talking about this for some reason. And their aim with these policies is to just integrate nature and sustainable development at all levels. And their policy focuses on 3 areas. And now these policies, you have to understand, are their driving factors for essentially all the other themes as well. And then they have governance and rights, because like we said, you cannot work on the environment without working with people. So this is all about social justice, equity, transparency, and inclusion, which is obviously very vital to them achieving what they want to do. And so their approaches are very rights-based and socially inclusive to conservation. And they're fundamental for effective natural resource management, because coming from Pakistan, natural resource allocation and management is going to play a very pivotal and very vital role in us going forward from all these climate emergencies that we're having. And the way that they do it is by focusing on really three things: indigenous people, gender equality and women's empowerment, and governance and right-based approaches like I talked about earlier. Now, indigenous people we're going to talk about more later. Indigenous people have been working sustainably with the environment essentially, and they have had their they've been using the resources, they've been doing it sustainably, and they haven't actually overexploited the way that the corporate world or the way that the rest of the world or governments actually are doing. So we really could and should learn from indigenous people and how their practices are working out. And then again, you cannot work on any serious issue by excluding almost 50% of the global population. This one interview that I would very highly recommend everyone to go listen to. It's the Melinda Gates interview with David Letterman. And she talks about all the work that that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done, especially in developing countries, and especially with respect to gender equality. And this woman is so impressive. Oh my God. She did computer science back in the 70s, a woman in science, and she started her work for IBM. Like back in this, like that was a big deal, right? Like they didn't take women seriously. And right now she's actually helping fund a lot of these women in science education. Her entire thing is diversity. So it's working with a lot of these communities that don't actually support their women's education.
Also, when you think about it, 50% of the world roughly is women. And when you're not having gender equality in the first place, then you cannot have solutions that will integrate both interests,
Very true.
The interests of humanity are not just the interests of man.
It is called mankind.
Oh God.
Humankind.
When coding and like all this stuff first took off, before they started making it a guy's thing, they actually were at first employing a bunch of women, because at the time women were most of the people who did the typing, right? They relegated women to typing. So when they were making the switch from typewriters in corporate offices to computers, they were hiring more women. But then they started paying a shit ton of money to do the job. And they were like, I don't think women are smart enough to do this anymore. So no.
I don't think they know how to save the money. So no.
Exactly.
So coming back to this, another theme that I found really interesting that I mentioned earlier is nature-based solutions. So they finally, in 2016, at the World Conservation Congress, and the member assembly, the IUCN members, they finally developed a resolution or adopted a resolution, which for the first time actually defined the use of nature for simultaneous benefits to biodiversity and human well-being. So I'm not going to say their definition, quote unquote, but what the basic gist of this definition is, like we talked about earlier, connecting human resources to nature. So seeing how we can use nature to fix whatever environmental problems we have right now. Ala, you have some examples for us, I believe?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about it a little more in the implications, but think about it like this. Let's say there's a forest and it has been destroyed by some asshole. I don't know. A dove. So you want to restore these trees. You could just go in there and they're like, all right, I'm going to plant some trees. We're planting trees. Yeah, that's great. But if you're looking at it with the nature-based solution point of view, then you're like, what trees will I plant so that I don't introduce something into the system that isn't endemic? And like Abba explained previously, endemic means something that's that is native to the area.
And nature-based solutions are really important, and which is why they actually set standards.
Yeah, and the aim of these standards is basically to increase demand for nature-based solutions while safeguarding people and nature, and then sort of bringing about sustainable change in the positive direction towards conservation. Like, for example, to mainstream nature-based solutions, a common language and framework would be required so that everyone knows what is being talked about, rather than, me calling it something and then somebody in the US calling it something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then, so like it's really important. You're right. I do agree. I think IUCN does set a really nice global framework. Another one of their themes that I found really interesting was the ecosystem management. And they use these approaches and they work with the governments and the local communities, so they can actually help curb these these climate disasters, to reduce the risk and help them adapt to climate change. So they address these information gaps and these capacity needs based on the sustainable management, conservation, and the restoration of ecosystems. And their basic aim is to achieve sustainable and resilient development. Because if you set up, like we've seen in Texas, you can't just set up systems and just expect them to go on for decades and millennia even. I don't know how long they thought it was going to go on. We really do need to weather whatever plants we set up. We really do need to see whatever we're putting in. Like we were talking about, like the roads that are being built in Pakistan, and 3 years later they're broken down and they need to be rebuilt. So the 3 metrics that they use is that they assess the ecosystem status, and then they use that status to help them adapt the ecosystem management for whatever they find are the neglected systems. And then they help enhance the resilience of communities to these climate change effects and help them reduce the risks. And then another theme that we obviously all really love, because this one is actually about science and economics. So what they do is, this is an entire scientific basis and their research for decision making in nature conservation, because obviously you can't do anything without science, let's be real.
Yep.
And this is just, this entire thing just encompasses of compiling data and assessing them against formal standards. And they provide access to this information. They publish research and their analysis, and then they interact with other peers in the conservation and science networks. Now, this membership is like a 13,000 person strong membership, and the UN 6 expert commissions, they support these assessments against the IUCN Red List. You all know how much we are going to love talking about the Red List. Mm-hmm. And they have the key biodiversity areas and the protected planet standards. They run these library and publication services. So if you want to actually look up anything, they have it all on the internet. You can go in to your public library, and I'm pretty sure you will find information there as well. And the standard for these are the knowledge standards that they set up, the peer networks that they've set up, and just their basic aim is to just share the knowledge that they've gathered over the years. Okay, Red List, you guys. Yay, finally to our most favorite part. Guys, Abha actually made us do IUCN just for this Red List. So
she did.
Yeah, so we really hope we do justice to it. Okay, so what is a Red List? It is actually the world's most comprehensive information source on threatened species, their status, and their links to livelihood. It is actually, another name for it is a barometer of life. And the reason why they call it that is because you know how a barometer assesses the atmospheric pressure to tell you what the weather is going to be like? Yeah, so they call themselves the barometer of species, of conservation of nature. So they're going to tell you, oh, hey, guess what? This thing is messing up. So do you guys want to work on that? So essentially just like kind of alarming people or telling people to prepare for them, for whatever's coming to them next. So the data that they hold on this Red List, they include non-threatened species as well as threatened species. And some of the taxonomic groups, I'm going to take a second here and let Abha explain it. Because guys, I Googled this stuff for a very long time and I really couldn't come up with words to explain what the hell does even taxonomic mean. These scientists, and they're holier than thou.
Aja was like, I have not seen this since high school.
I'm not an expert, but taxonomic basically means structured or categorized, kind of. So it's all categorized based on their characteristics and their genetics, and all of the animals and plants and everything has been put into this taxonomic classification.
Oh, yeah. So, like, the way they used to be, like, genus, and then the species of the thing, and then the family,
Exactly.
and the group, and that's all I got. That's it right there.
Exactly.
Yeah, because they don't want to keep it just calling it groups somehow. So, yeah, the taxonomic groups, they have either completely been assessed or almost completely assessed. So their entire goal is to at least have the most number of taxonomic groups that they can have completely assessed, so they at least know about the species, how it operates. And these taxonomic groups, they include mammals, birds, amphibians, freshwater crabs, warm water and reef building corals, sharks and rays, groupers. I can go on, honestly.
And this, you mean, is like the list of groups that have been almost completely assessed, yeah?
Yes. They have been either completely assessed or are like almost completely assessed. And the thing with this is, like, obviously this list grows larger with each update, because as they find more information on these species, and they obviously update the information that they have, and they share this information with the entire union. So there's like a graph that we're going to put on the show notes to actually, like, it gives a very comprehensive view, even though it's just a small little graph, of how much work they have actually done in terms of species, because this is just like base numbers about how they've actually expanded the number of taxonomic groups that have full and complete red list assessments, so that they can improve, so we can improve our knowledge on the status of the world's biodiversity. The way that they come up with this red list is that they have this committee that sets the standards for scientific quality for the IUCN's work on biodiversity assessments. It develops guidelines on the application of these standards, and it ensures that evaluations of petitions against the listing of a particular taxonomic group on the IUCN Red List are carried out professionally and impartially. And it builds on collaboration with other organizations that are working on these biodiversity assessments.
So the IUCN, as we spoke about it, is based out of Switzerland. But on a day-to-day basis, the Red List is managed and compiled by the Global Species Program Red List Unit, which is based in Cambridge, of all places. I do not know why. This draws on information from over 16,000 scientists and all the partner organizations of IUCN to get local and specific research outputs on a regular basis. Each of these species that they are looking at is rigorously evaluated. They have certain criteria like population size, rate of decline, geographic range, where they're found, what kind of habitat they need, are they super specific or not, all of these things. And then along with input from some other commissions and organizations, they compile all of this data on that one species and then use it in their assessment. And their assessment has 8 official categories. They go from extinct, which is there is no doubt that this animal does not exist in the wild anymore, or anywhere anymore, actually, because extinct in the wild is a separate category, in which case, they exist in zoos, but not in the wild anymore. And then it goes on, critically endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, least concern. And then they also classify 2 other categories, which are like data deficient, which means they haven't been able to get enough data on this species, or not evaluated, which is basically either new species or species that are currently out of the scope of being able to be, studied rigorously.
Okay, I have a question. When they say extinct, so like they looked everywhere?
Yeah, so the way they define that is they say that an animal is extinct when there is no reasonable doubt that the last individual has died.
Okay, but do they have good prosecutor? Because the burden of proof lies with the prosecution.
I mean, it depends. With the amphibians and the reptiles, it's really iffy, because they are hard to spot sometimes, especially in places like the Amazon. There are things there that people thought were extinct and they listed as extinct in the wild. And then come to find out years later, they just ran away from human beings and they're still there. But when they said the white rhino is about to be extinct, then yes, that one for sure. The rhino is not hiding.
Yeah, it's not in your cover,
Yeah, exactly.
guys. Don't look.
So they evaluate it and they say, look, there is like less than statistically significant chance that this animal might be hiding somewhere. And when it gets to that point where that percentage is so low that it doesn't really matter anymore, then they declare it extinct.
Okay.
Yeah, but and yes, like you said, several taxonomic groups have been thoroughly studied, but I'm just going to put it into perspective. Just about 10 million species basically are classified, and out of them only 93,500 have been evaluated, out of which more than 26,000 are threatened with extinction. And out of the species that are threatened with extinction at the moment, 41% of all known amphibians are listed under that.
Oh my God.
34%
wow.
of... Yeah, it's a huge percentage. 34% of all known coniferous trees, 33% of reef-building corals, and 25% of mammals are all listed under this threatened with extinction category.
Why are humans not in those mammals?
I just want to say, guys, if you're listening to this podcast, I just want to speak up for one of my favorite animals on earth, all reptiles, specifically snakes. You guys, 41% of them, like all the amphibians, please leave amphibians alone. Let them go from water to land peacefully. Leave the frogs alone. Leave the reptiles alone.
I know, it's really sad. And then a lot of people have asked me this before, whereas, we have all of this knowledge of all of these species, so why haven't we studied all of them? Well, the simple answer is, even with the IUCN, there's only about 16,000 to 17,000 experts there. And it's expensive to study species, y'all. It's really expensive and time-consuming.
Yeah, for real.
Oh, so you got money up, huh?
How does this sort of affect people and governments? Ala, do you want to explain all the implications of IUCN and the Red List?
Yeah, so let's get into it, you guys. First of all, I'm going to talk about the Red List since we were kind of just on that. As Audra and Ava have explained, it's really revolutionary, and the work that they're doing, it's going to last for a very long time. The number one implication or impact of the Red List is how researchers can use it. And that research translates, of course, to conservation efforts. So the constant need to go back and revise these things and come up with new things, I think that's part of what keeps the Red List as great as it is.
As we found even from distress systems, we have to constantly come back to it.
Yeah, we do. So they revised it in 1994. I believe they revised it again in 2009. And the reason they revised it in 1994 was because at that time, those different categories and classifications that Abba mentioned, as far as extinct or extinct in the wild, things like that, there weren't sections for things that weren't identified yet or stuff like that, or data deficient. So they revised it. Then they had to revise it again in 2009. And then they revised it, I believe, recently in 2016. So a good example of what these revisions did is a study that I included in the show notes, done by a fantastic guy called Matt Hayward. And he was trying to show how threats can be assessed for different animals using the Red List. If you check our show notes, you'll see this graph that we have here, which I think you guys can also see it. So if you take a look at it, it was pretty cool. He made this, though. He didn't just get this from the IUCN.
Wow, that is cool.
He broke this down. So he broke it down into what the threats are. So human intrusion, climate change, pollution, residential, commercial development, agriculture. He broke it down into a bunch of things. And he was able to use the Red List to show improvement versus decline, as well as statistical error. And that's kind of cool that you can use one database to do that amount of summarizing or to draw those kind of conclusions from one database. Usually you need like 500
Yeah.
things to do one thing. So some stuff that he found, which sad, is, and this was 2009, but 181 species showed genuine improvement or showed decline in status in the 2009 Iucn Red List. 37 improved, 144 declined, which is kind of sad.
Oh, wow.
I know. And the extra sad part of it is he was able to use data from the Red List to deduce that 82.6%, give or take 3%, of improving species and 91.8, give or take 2%, of declining species occurred in protected areas. So there's more decline in protected areas than there are improvements.
Yeah, that's why they're so important.
And that was 2009. Of course, the IUCN has been doing a lot since then. Besides the Red List, though, I know that we did talk about it a little bit. There are 5 other databases maintained by the IUCN. I'm not going to delve into them real deep, but I'm going to, tell you a little bit about them. So first of all is the World Database on Protected Areas. This is a pretty popular one, right? It's the most comprehensive global database on any type of terrestrial and marine protected areas. And it's actually a joint thing done by the IUCN and UNEP, who we talked about last week. It's been around since 1981, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. So UNEP is doing shit.
That is cool.
Also, there's the Green List of Protected Areas. I know this sounds confusing because I just said protected areas, but the difference is the World Database is very comprehensive database telling you about these areas, telling you where's doing what, and the Green List is more like a global standard of best practice. It's one of those things that came about due to those nature-based solution resolutions that AJWA talked about. So they basically certify, they certify these protected and conserved areas. So you can be on the World Database on Protected Areas, but not be on the Green List of Protected Areas. Like, those are like the people that are really doing their shit. The next one is the Key Biodiversity Area Database. Key biodiversity areas are just the most important places in the world for species and their habitats. I know that might be confusing because you're like, isn't everywhere important? It is, but there are specific places that have such a huge amount of biodiversity that is also endemic to the region. So like, there's so many different types of things, but all of them are really, really local from there. And that makes it a really key area. There's other things as well, but what this database does is it helps identify these places, it helps map them out, it helps monitor them, and it helps conserve them so we can safeguard the most critical areas, like the Amazon, for example. Then there's the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, which is a little different from the rest of these things because the rest of these things are very open to public knowledge and researchers and stuff. But this one is kind of something for more corporations and organizations. I saw that actually one of the people who use it, or one of the corporations or groups who use it, is the U.S. Army. So it's up-to-date information from the Red List, from the WDPA, which is the World Database of Protected Areas, like I said, and from the Key Biodiversity Area database. They combine them so that the corporations or the entities that are using them are like, all right, before we go off in this area, let's make sure we're not messing with anything. I thought that was kind of cool, because that's a big problem that only the people who create them can fix. So it's good that those people are getting on it. And finally, they have the Global Invasive Species Database, which is just to highlight public awareness about invasive species. As the world is getting more global, this is becoming more and more of a problem, where you'll see an area where, again, we love biodiversity, but it's not always helpful in the long run to that biodiversity if we have species coming in that don't belong there. They can really wreck stuff. 2 commissions that I'm going to highlight are the CESP, so that's the one on environmental, economic, and social policy, and the one on environmental law. The reason I want to bring up the CESP is because of their work with indigenous communities. I know, like, if you live in the US or you live in Canada, when you think of indigenous communities, you think of the people who are native to the land, who were here before colonization. But when I say indigenous communities here, I'm referring to every area where the people who are there are the people who were there first. And so not just in these specific areas. So the people who, like Adwa pointed out, have been sustainably using the land. The thing is, although technology is fantastic in providing food and resources, sometimes it's not sustainable because we tend to put profit above long-term use. But the CESP works to give Indigenous and community-conserved areas back some power. It's rights-based and it's participation-based. So, like, these people have to get in there. Some things that they have done to that regard is that they support the governance of food and agricultural research in regions like the Andean Altiplano in South Asia, as well as West Africa and West Asia. So, yeah, they actually do a lot of work when it comes to agriculture in West Africa. That's a big thing that I can personally say that they've done. A primary aspect of the work that the members do is they also try to reform mining operations. I mean, we all know that as great as exploration and mining are, for what they provide, they do have a lot of drawbacks. And a lot of times these companies come in and they tend to ignore the people who are indigenous to the area, the natives, the locals, the community. But the CSP is trying to work to change that. And they're working in so many countries. Another cool commission that I'm just going to talk about real quick is the Commission on Environmental Law. This is a policy podcast, so you know we have to talk about law. So they do take a more leadership technical role in helping develop international conservation agreements. That's really what they do. And I know Audra talked about that. An example of that is the High Seas Alliance, which is a partnership of different organizations and groups that's trying to talk about conservation of and protection of the high seas. They have been able to promote the creation of a global network of prosecutors to deal with these issues, and they have allies from different organizations, including the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement. The high seas are basically international ocean waters. That's what they are, just so you know. So this alliance protects the international ocean waters. So now that we've said all the good stuff, let's get into all the issues. This is my favorite part. So the institutional history of the IUCN is one in which different program objectives have been incorporated through changes in understanding human environmental relationships, right? And so everything is really linked. And sometimes the different commissions or different themes will be covering similar things. But the problem is that this has led to a sort of structural constraint where they're unable to satisfy these objectives because before they can satisfy them, they keep expanding them, since so many different themes and so many different commissions or so many different regions are trying to address the same thing. Before they can satisfy step one in the goal, they've made us a step 4. So then it's leading to some things just never quite getting finished and just a bunch of open things.
But do you think it's better to at least
That's
bring
interesting.
them out in the open?
I don't, because it's a research organization. There's still going to be awareness. What I'm talking about is not even the research. What I'm saying is because of this situation that they have, and also a big part of this is because of the way their members are set up. Because of all these members stretched out so far with such a far-reaching structure that isn't very centered, they sometimes it takes them longer to achieve things that maybe they could have done sooner. Another thing, talking about the structure, a lot of the issues here come from the structure, is that because it has a combination of all these different members, there are very powerful, resourceful organizations, and there are less powerful organizations. So, for example, there are organizations that can finance things. There are member countries. There are big intergovernmental organizations that they work with. Those people tend to be the ones providing more money and more research and more solutions most of the time. And then the less powerful, maybe the more developing areas, or there's, like we said, with the indigenous people and things like that, tend to be the ones who are beholding in terms of execution more because they have labor to offer. And it's not very like black and white. There's a mix, obviously. On the plus side, this means that, they are kind of utilizing strengths. On the downside, it did for a while. It meant that these people who were doing were not necessarily the ones deciding what they got to do.
No,
Does that make sense? So that's something that the CESP has really been working to change as well. But what they're doing is they're growing their number of offices, and they're also making more transnational and supranational institutions and agreements. Okay, so now we talked about general shortcomings. I'm just going to go real quick about the shortcomings of the Red List. So like we said, there's a biased taxonomic coverage over the species level of diversity known to science. People tend to focus more on birds, mammals, amphibians than they do maybe plants or fungi. And even within the birds, mammals, amphibians, animals, and stuff, there's less focus on things like reptiles and fish. There's just not as much coverage.
Which upsets you, obviously, because of your love for snakes.
It does. And frogs. I don't like toads, but frogs.
I'm gonna quickly intervene here, and I'm gonna say that it's not a shortcoming of the Red List as much as it's a shortcoming of species research as a whole.
Also, another thing that you will find is that with invertebrates, plants, fungi, all these other things, there's an average assessment of less than 3% of known species. So we know 68% of animals, but we know like less than 3% of invertebrates, plant, and fungi.
I'm just playing devil's advocate, but they are also harder to study.
That is a good point. That is true. But I think that's why there needs to be a push for it, because whenever somebody starts a study or anything like that, they look to large databases like this. You know what I mean? I found quite a few papers of scientists complaining about this who study plants. There is quite a gap still. Like Abba pointed out, there are 390,000 plant species approximately still to be assessed. And if we use the estimates of global threat status of plants, we can infer, somebody inferred, not me, another scientist, that as many as 115,291 of the not evaluated plant species are of elevated conservation concern. And I know here I focused a lot on the Red List and the shortcomings here, but this sort of adaptability issues, as far as it's showing itself as a constraint in other databases as well, as far as being able to take something, when something is designed for one thing, it's very hard to use it for other things, okay? So for instance, the green list areas in France and China, that's where most of the green list areas are. But some of the areas that might need that kind of standard would have limited funding. They wouldn't be able to meet the same criteria as a country like France. You know what I mean? So maybe adapt criteria to fit what you are dealing with. By the way, do you guys want to guess which country in North America has the only protected sites on the green list?
Canada? Mexico.
Canada?
Mexico! Good one, Audra. It's Mexico. Mexico has 2, Canada 0, America 0, all of the Caribbean islands 0. So we can talk forever about the future of the many things and programs under the IUCN. Like, seriously, you can talk about this organization for a while. They do a lot, guys. Let's talk about where these people are headed. We're going to start with the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. God damn, these things are long. So the NBSAPs, they are the main vehicles of national implementation for the Convention on Biological Diversity. I know we talked about it in episode 1, we talked about it in episode 0, and we keep saying the words biological diversity, guys. We are obsessed. We're not going to stop saying it. So these are the processes through which societies can come together, and they make the decision of, okay, where, when, how are these ecosystems going to be conserved? How are they going to be used sustainably? And how is it going to be shared equally? The IUCN is a big contributor to the development of these strategies as a conservation organization. So it's not necessarily just their thing, though. It's a UN thing, UN convention, but they contribute a lot. Databases, obviously, are a big, big part of this. The one thing I will say is right now they're trying to expand, like I said. They have about 45 regional offices. That's not enough for the amount of members they have and the amount of work they do.
For 1,400 members?
Like they said, they're expanding, so we'll see how that goes in the near future. Now let's talk about the future of some nature-based solutions. Audra talked about these a little bit. She explained what they are, the link, and there are a ton of nature-based solutions, so I cannot cover them all. I'm just going to highlight. So the first one is the Ridge to Reef initiative, which is an improvement to the water sphere of things. Basically, they want to monitor the biodiversity of marine habitats and coastal wetlands. And what they're trying to do is protect them and protect these areas and demonstrate sustainable approaches that you can use in these areas, especially showing that balance and connection between salt and freshwater ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to use the Florida Everglades as an example because this is something that I don't think is ever going to hear this podcast, but Dr. Jennings made me passionate about, ironically. Oh my God. The Florida Everglades is an example of what can happen when there's a little disruption to the balance of a network of water. The Everglades are like the giant network of swamps, wetlands, and other types of water bodies. And they have the biggest estuary in the U.S. I think the biggest, if not one of the biggest. One of the problems they've had, obviously, has been decline in species. I'm going to mention two things. For years, the salinity levels in Florida have been rising and destroying seagrass in the Florida Bay Area, while some areas are dealing with something called red tide. If you live in Florida, you know about the red tide blooms. They're they're so hard to predict. It smells awful. It makes people sick. And what they are is basically they're toxic algae blooms. But they're also natural to the area at the same time. So it's very complicated. The salinity levels are happening because the way water is disposed of and taken out of different parts of the Everglades, it's not well monitored enough. And you cannot have these huge change in salinity levels where it should not exist because marine life will die. So that's what something like Ridge to Reef can avoid. So another nature-based solution is the protected areas under the Green List. There are currently only 49 sites on the list globally, but it's a fairly new list, so cut them some slack. They are adding more and more to them. And they set those global standards like we talked about. They have the Natural Solutions Manual, which is now a series. So it provides a lot of recommendations, disaster risk reduction, adaptation and mitigation of climate change, and addressing desertification as well. Something that I was not expecting is cryptocurrency, you guys. Did you guys know that?
No, I did not. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's becoming really popular in environmental solutions. So this all started because basically it's a way to be more transparent, right? So what they're trying to do is they're collaborating with the Swiss-based foundation called Porini, on something called a fair finance strategy. And what they're going to do is they're going to link the standards to new technologies, specifically blockchain technology and cryptocurrency, which is a computer-based system for you to independently verify decisions and transactions that you make financially through public, independent, and transparent review. So this way, everything is recorded, it's sequential, and it's in what we call perpetuity, which economically, it's like a bond with no maturity date, so it can last forever. It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
The UN World Food Program already recently tried this. They did something similar with blockchain, where they were trying to help remote upland farmers receive food supplies and cash through blockchain registered transactions with their suppliers. And it was actually successful. So since it worked with the UN World Food Program, other organizations are trying it now. So this has been a very full episode. We have covered a lot. If you still want to learn more, obviously there's the show notes and tons of links in there. There's also the World Wildlife Fund. I think that's a great agency. We mentioned them a little bit. They work with multilateral and bilateral agencies, so like a bunch of people to promote sustainable development in poorer countries and protect natural ecosystems and populations. They work with the IUCN a lot, so check them out. There's Oceana, which is the largest nonprofit exclusively dedicated to the world's oceans and to shielding all the life in it.
Go Oceana!
I know. They're a nice organization. They always make me happy. I don't know what it is about their ads or their marketing, but they're very good at making you feel happy.
Yeah, I love their Instagram page. Follow it, guys.
Right? So these are some things you can check out. Of course, links in the show notes. Question for you guys, though, before we start to wrap this up. We talked a lot about different kind of species, different kind of protected areas. And I just want to know, is there anybody out there who lives in or has lived near a protected area that made it on that green list? So that's what we have for you guys this week. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we are going to be talking about the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, which I don't know why, but every time I read that, I think cigar, but it's CGIAR. And we're going to focus on two of its research centers because that's kind of what they do. International Water Management Institute and the International Food Policy Research Institute. It's a global partnership that unites international organizations in research about food security, water, human health and nutrition, and sustainable management of natural resources.
All right, this has been super insightful. Thank you, Ala and Ajwa. And I think we're going to end it here. What do you guys think, listeners? If you're still stuck around with us, let us know. Tell us how we can be better. Tell us what you want to listen to. You can do that on Twitter at Planet Policy Pal, on Instagram at Planet Policy Pals with an S, and like our Facebook page. Check out our website, planetpolicypals.com, for updates and show notes. And also, you can send us an email if you want to. That is our show for today. Thank you so much for sticking with us and listening.
Thank you.
And see you in 2 weeks. Until then, keep learning, pals.